Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope that you're doing well. I hope you're having a great weekend. I'd like to discuss Home, the penultimate novel from Toni Morrison. I reread it this past week, and it was an insightful reread. It's a very short book, and it's as I mentioned, the second to last of her novels, and it's one that explores a lot of the themes that and revisits those themes from her earlier books. In my mind, specifically, The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon, and it's a book that does emphasize, as so many of her works do, the integrity, the critical nature of human relationships and human interactions, and how critical those relationships are to understanding what it means to be human. A lot of writers, I think, wanted to explore what it meant to be human from this perspective of human consciousness, particularly in the 20th century. That was like a real big emphasis. And Morrison does that, but I think she's also very interested in this relational aspect to humanity, and that's something she loves exploring in her books, and it's something that I gravitate towards when I read her books. But Home is her penultimate novel. It's along with A Mercy and then her final novel, God Help the Child. These were really the only three books that I was reading from Morrison as they were published, as they were springing into our hands. These were the books I could read just because of my age. And so it's interesting to sort of catch major writers, major artists, even like major athletes at this very clear twilight in their careers. Morrison, as with contemporaries like Philip Roth or even Don DeLillo, have moved to writing some much shorter novels, almost like long novellas, at the end of their careers. And it's interesting to see how, with Morrison specifically, she was returning to themes from her earlier books. I think there's a very clear reading of A Mercy as a distillation of Beloved in some ways, and exploring Beloved, the same ideas of Beloved in some ways. And I think Home really homes in on some of the ideas from The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon. The way that Song of Solomon has this sort of return to the South, and this sense of people who are no longer enslaved returning to a place where their ancestors were enslaved. That's something that feels critical to Home. But it's, as with all of Morrison's novels, there are aspects to it that really show how dark human interactions can be, how just absolutely brutal and dehumanizing they can be. And so that's something that I think turns a lot of people off, but it's also something that is very real. And I don't feel like Toni Morrison was ever trying to use it for like shock value or to like cheapen or glorify that brutality, but rather to examine when relationships dehumanize others, how do those people who have felt dehumanized, how do they then like recoup their humanity? How do they either try to like rehumanize themselves and those around them, or do they turn and dehumanize others? And I think that's a critical aspect to much of her writing, and it's certainly something that's distilled in Home. We have Frank Money. He's a Korean War veteran, so we're in the 1950s. He's not living in the southeastern United States anymore, but he's very much experiencing PTSD, and we see that. We're dropped into his consciousness almost right away, and we can just see how discombobulated he is. He's in a mental institution where they're trying to see if he's like capable to be moved potentially to a prison, but he's very clearly discombobulated, and his disorientation is something that we experience as readers right away. And we slowly peel back layers. In one respect, it's similar to the way John Webster, the Jacobean playwright of the 17th century, sort of saw the skull beneath the skin, and so we're going to peel back the layers to see just how brutal like villains can be. But there's another aspect in which we're peeling back layers to understand trauma, to understand traumas that have been received and traumas that have been committed, and how those remain in a person's consciousness and in a person's memory. The relationship between Frank and his sister C, we're told is critical, but it takes the full book to realize just how critical it is. There is, at the time people were identifying, there's this sense of the Odyssey, of a traumatized Odysseus at the end of the Trojan War trying to return to his wife. And here we have Frank trying to return to his sister to save her, and not totally understanding why, just sort of getting this message, and it's like that suddenly refocuses and recenters a man who has lost so much, and gives him this sense of purpose of what he needs to do. And it's also a book that, as with so many of Morrison's books, it explores the ways in which societies can be very dehumanizing towards women. and the very dangerous ways that those occur. I don't want to do spoilers, but specific instances that occur in this book have just occurred in the past couple of years, and it was national news when we found out that this was happening in immigration services. So it is a book that is really taking us on a journey and trying to understand, I think, fundamentally, is there redemption in human relationships? Is there a way for people who have participated in that violence, or participated in ways that dehumanize others and that dehumanize themselves, to try and recoup some sense of redemption, some sense of their humanity? And I think that's part of what Frank Money is trying to figure out. Is there a sense of redemption? Seeing the violence he saw as a youth, seeing the violence from the Korean War, seeing the violence towards just civilians and children in the Korean War. Is there hope for someone like him who has seen all of that? And that's the question Morrison's asking. And a question that, as so often, she often leaves the reader to really identify that. In her essays, which can be found in the Source of Self-Regard, she has a couple of essays. One is called Home, and it shows how she's expanding a lot of the themes she started with around what it means to be African American, living in the United States in the middle of the 20th century as she starts, and sort of exploring that, to then extending those questions to what does it mean to be a member of humanity globally, as she looks at a much more global international view in some of her essays like Home. But there's also this fascinating essay, Invisible Ink, which was published about a year before Home, in which she explicitly talks about all of the choices writers make to force readers to make assumptions and then play with those assumptions. And she talks about how she did it. She does it in Paradise with like the first sentence, and she gives some other examples. But it's something very clearly that is happening in Home. There are instances we see that we then see repeated and extended. And those repetitions and those extensions really allow us to make assumptions as readers that then Morrison subverts or amplifies, and then causes us to ask a new question as a reader and to interact with the text in a new way. So it is a book I recommend. I think it returns to a lot of the ideas from The Bluest Eye and Song of Solomon, though I would say it's not as strong as those. It doesn't have the same tactile nature of writing that she usually has, where you're just overwhelmed with your senses, the taste, the colors, the scents, the noises. But one example towards the end of the book, it is present there. It's just not as frequent as in her other novels. It was so bright, brighter than he remembered. The sun, having sucked away the blue from the sky, loitered there in a white heaven, menacing Lotus, torturing its landscape, but failing, constantly failing to silence it. Children still laughed, ran, shouted their games. Women sang in their backyards while pinning wet sheets on clotheslines. Occasionally, a soprano was joined by a neighboring alto or a tenor just passing by. Take me to the water, take me to the water, take me to the water to be baptized. Frank had not been on this dirt road since 1949, nor had he stepped on the wooden planks covering the rain's washed-out places. There were no sidewalks, but every front yard and backyard sported flowers, protecting vegetables from disease and predators. Marigolds, nasturtiums, dahlias, crimson, purple, pink, and china blue. Had these trees always been this deep, deep green? The sun did her best to burn away the blessed peace found under the wide old trees, did her best to ruin the pleasure of being among those who do not want to degrade or destroy you. Try as she might, she could not scorch the yellow butterflies away from scarlet rose bushes, nor choke the songs of birds. And so there are passages like that, but again, so much more of it is it's looking at the relationship. If Webster was looking for the skull beneath the skin, Morrison is often looking for the heart beneath our skin. And so let me know if you've read this. I know it very rarely is in even the top half of most people's reading from Toni Morrison, but I think there's much to explore in even the smaller gems produced by great artists. As I'd mentioned, her essays in the Source of Self-Regard do, I think, provide another window into much of her fiction and into books she was exploring. I mentioned, of course, The Bluest Eye is a book that she's sort of returning to in the way that A Mercy returns to Beloved. But I don't know that she quite captures what she wanted to in the distillation from The Bluest Eye, because I think God Help the Child really returns to this book as well. Cain from Jean Toomer, which I read earlier this year, and absolutely, that's an absolute masterpiece. I highly recommend. That feels like a book that has some influence and intertextuality. There are aspects of Frank Money, and it's not entirely clear, but there are aspects of Frank Money, and part of the ways in which he feels haunted, part of the ways in which he feels just so disoriented at times, that remind me specifically of the middle third of Native Son from Richard Wright. And I had mentioned, of course, the Odyssey. There are themes from the Odyssey, but it's very much questioning, are there any heroes that return from a conflict like the Trojan War, and what has been done to those who have been heroic, who have been brave. What has been done to them, and how does that affect them? But the other book that I was thinking of is one I'll be reading later this month, To Kill a Mockingbird from Harper Lee. And the ways in which this book asks very different questions and presents, I think, a very different fundamental view of a society that is fairly contemporaneous to that in Home. So I'll be interested to see that and return to that. But again, I hope everybody's having a great weekend, and